Hello, good evening. Welcome to the latest episode of our China Tech series on Make and Play. Today, this show will be kind of meta in terms of topic, since we are talking about the current state of podcast industry in China. So as you can see, I've attached a Notion page on the show notes where you can get access to all the links to the PDF research reports and the critical numbers that I mentioned in this show. So let's deep dive into the podcast industry in China. Many people consider the year 2020 to be the origin year of podcast in China, or some people might say the podcast boom in China. There are two major reasons for that. The first is that unfortunately COVID broke out in China that year and many other places in the world. So a lot of people have to be forced to stay at home and start listening to a lot of audio products. And music and audiobooks have already matured by that point, but podcast definitely grabbed that opportunity and started its explosive growth in 2020. The second reason is there are a few critical companies and events that just got started right before 2020, so could be in year 2018 or 19. And one of them is called Podcast China, which is this large podcast annual festival. Happens once a year. And as you can see here, the first research report is actually written by them. So now let's look at these two research reports. I will share some interesting numbers here about the podcast industry in China. So first of all, here are some common trends found in these two reports. First is the gender breakdown of the podcast audience in China. Just to note here, the sampled audience in these two reports are all active and hyper interactive podcast listeners. So there are definitely quite a lot bias here. This is definitely not something that's 100% scientific or statistically accurate, just for reference purpose. Now back to the gender breakdown. We see that we have slightly more male listeners than female listeners. The ratio is about 1.3 to 1. And the most popular cities with podcast listeners are as follows: Beijing, Shanghai, Guangdong, and all the other tier 1 cities. So here we can see that most podcast listeners in China are living or working in the larger cities in China and in urban area. Secondly, reading from the reports, we know that 80% of the podcast listeners have acquired college degrees or beyond. So they are relatively higher educated people. And then also 80% of the podcast listeners in China are between the age of 18 and 35. So combine these two stats together, we know that the average listener in China is probably someone either still in college, grad school, or fresh out of school and just started their job. And the top two fields are, first one, obviously, college grad students, and second would be people working in the IT or tech industry in China. Third, let's look at the listening history of the average listener in China. You can see that more than half of the audience just recently started listening to podcasts, and this means that they first started after the year 2017. So here we can tell that podcast industry is still a rising, fresh industry in China. And more than half of the people interviewed say they listen to podcasts daily, which shows you the stickiness of the podcast in China. And when asked what audio consumption they shift from, the most answered is music streaming. So a lot of the podcast listeners are converted music listeners. Now let's look at the platforms and the way people listen to podcasts. From the poll, we know that over 60% of the listeners using iPhones. And then surprisingly, more than 10% of the people listen through car audio system. And then when asked when and where did they listen to the podcast, 60% say they listen during their commutes back and forth to and from work. And then 47% of the time is happening before sleep and 40% during doing household chores. So these are the top 3 answers. Next, 6, let's look at the trend of podcast apps in China. So here we can see that from the year 2019 to 2020 and goes beyond that, we can see that people are starting to use less of the Apple native podcast apps, which used to be the most popular app where people listen to podcasts in China. And now the top 3 players besides Apple is Himalaya at first, and NetEase Music at number 2, and 小宇宙, or which means Little Cosmos in Chinese, at number 3. So for these 3 companies, Himalaya is essentially the Audible in China. So their main focus was in audiobooks, and they recently started expanding into the podcast industry. Second, NetEase Music. So NetEase is known to many people in China or in the world as the 2nd largest game company in China. They also help Blizzard run most of their games in China. And music is probably their 2nd most important division right now. So NetEase Music has its own podcast division under that. And then the 3rd player is 小宇宙 Little Cosmos. They are the only one that is specializing in podcast only. And instead of having the host uploading podcast content to the platforms directly, they adopted more traditional or more international way of having the user or hosts uploading the RSS links. So this really set them apart as a more pure podcast provider. Now let's look at the most popular topics in Chinese podcasts. First, I would call this like the greater entertainment, which includes things like TV, movie, and music, and or sometimes sports, since these are kind of intertwined. And the second would be things like history and politics. The 3rd place would be tech, business / finance. Again, these topics are often intertwined in the podcast. And the 4th place would be comedy, which is a rising star category in the year 2020 and 2021. To be honest, I think right now they might be approaching number 1, if not it's number 1 already. We just saw a rapid growth in the comedy podcast in China. And then let's look at people's favorite style of podcast recording. Here we can see that most people like when they have more than 2 hosts in the show, so it would be a multiple people show. Second favorite style is one-on-one interview, and solo is at 3rd. And the most popular or accepted length of podcast per episode is somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes per episode. Now let's look at something beyond the just listen to the show. Here, based on 2 reports, the fan or listener's favorite method of interaction with the show. First would be through a WeChat public account. So what this does is that it allows the hosts or producers of the podcast show to publish either daily or weekly updates or announcements about their show. So this will be kind of like a newsletter. And second way is through a WeChat fan/audience group chat. So this is pretty similar to a regular iMessage or text message group chat where you can go inside this group chat and talk with other fans of the same show. And the most acceptable way of monetization, this is the opinions from the audience. The first would be merch store. So essentially selling things like, hoodies or water bottles with the show logos on it. And second way would be doing some offline live events. So some examples I've seen is that once a show gets relatively popular, the host will start to have some offline events where they will do a live recording in a coffee shop or bookstore where fans can attend. And sometimes revenue can be generated through selling the tickets. And last, we look at the in-show or in-podcast ads. Looks like the most preferable way would be ads that are read by the host. So these 12 items are the summary I got from reading the two research reports on podcasts in China. If you are interested in reading more about these, feel free to go to the link in the show notes. And you can use Google Translate or other translation software to get the idea. And as we are approaching March, the season 3 of our show will be starting soon. So if you have any suggestions on topics, whether it's on China tech or other topics, feel free to direct message me on the calling platform or any other platforms to listen to podcast. Thank you, and I hope you all have a good weekend. Bye-bye.